Black Americans experience a level of discrimination and racial disparity bias within the criminal justice system as well. Aside from the disproportionate rate of prosecution of African Americans, law enforcement being held accountable for killings of minorities still remains a key component to racial equity. I spoke with New York Attorney General Letitia James to find out what Juneteenth looks like within the justice system.
The justice system, we have a broken criminal justice system. And as we celebrate the 156th anniversary of the end of slavery, this is the year in which New York is recognizing Juneteenth as a statewide holiday. And it's a holiday, again, which recognizes that in Galveston, Texas, they were the last state to learn that they were free 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's important that as we celebrate that liberty, as we celebrate the freedom of slaves and of African Americans, we also recognize that we still have a number of issues that need to be addressed, not only in New York, but all across this nation, including a criminal justice system, including a system where oftentimes too many African American men and women are killed by police, by law enforcement. We need to talk about justification, non-lethal uses of force. We need to talk and retrain our police officers. We need to talk about de-escalation and the intersection of mental illness. We need to, again, talk about institutional wealth and economic development in communities of color. We need to talk about the student loan debt that individuals are struggling with each and every day. We need to talk about, again, minority-owned and women-owned businesses. They need to get assistance. They need to get loans. They need to get some of this American relief funds that are available. Unfortunately, it's been subjected to litigation, and minority-owned firms, unfortunately, will not get assistance from the federal government as a result of litigation that was initiated by some conservative groups. It's important that, again, we have an educational system that, again, talks about American history, but American history includes African American history. All of these issues and more, we need to understand that the fight still continues. From the injustices of the pandemic, which have been brought to bear, all of this and more, we need to have an honest and open conversation about the struggle for justice in our society.
Attorney General, it's hard to think about this past year and not think about the strongest modern civil rights movement of our lifetime following the murder of George Floyd by convicted former police officer Derek Chauvin. After the case, Attorney General Keith Ellison in Minnesota said, "I would not call today's verdict justice, however, because justice implies true restoration, but it is accountability, which is the first step towards justice." I just want to get your reaction to those words from the Minnesota Attorney General.
You know, justice continues. You know, the conviction of just one law enforcement officer doesn't bring us justice. The struggle for justice continues in so many efforts. The reality is that Black men and women and people of color in general, unfortunately, and those who are struggling with mental illness are still dying at the hands of law enforcement. And so we obviously need to do more. But it's important that all voices are heard, that everyone participate in democracy, that individuals understand that the progress that people of color have made over the years, from slavery to Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement, and now in the aftermath of a racial reckoning following the murder of George Floyd, there has always been setbacks. There have always been individuals who respond with distractions and set us back. And it's going to require that all of us, again, use our voice, use the power to protest, and use our vote to make change in our society. It is so critically important because the struggle for justice continues.
The desire is that we should not have to rely on the advent of technology for the existence of justice. But as technology advances, how does that shape the role of an attorney general as you preside over the office?
So as the former public advocate of the city of New York, I was one of the first elected officials to call for body-worn cameras of law enforcement officers. That was in the aftermath of the murder of Eric Garner in Staten Island. And so what we need to do is make sure that law enforcement officers all across this nation are equipped with body-worn cameras so that we can objectively capture the encounters, street encounters with law enforcement. We also need to make sure that we amend our laws, use of force laws in the state of New York and all across this country, and justification, so that law officers not use their guns as a first means of addressing encounters with civilians who they claim, who they pose, who they, in their subjective view, claim as a threat. We need to use de-escalation. We need to use space. We need to use time. We need to use communication. We need to use mental health professionals and others to address individuals who are in the throes of mental illness, or individuals, obviously, who unfortunately are struggling with drug abuse. We also need to retrain our officers. It's really critically important that we retrain our officers who do not view Black men as threats. We also, as threats, particularly in situations where other means can be utilized. We also need to use things like ShotSpotter to identify and address the gun violence that we are experiencing in urban centers all across this nation. We need to embrace technology as a means to provide accountability and transparency to the general public. It's so critically important. And we need to do more reporting, and we need to make sure that when there are law enforcement officers who unfortunately are violating the law, that those law enforcement officers be held accountable. And the best way to do that, again, is with reporting and with body-worn cameras. And when other law enforcement officers recognize that they have a duty to respond and to intercede and to intervene in situations where you have a law enforcement officer who is violating the civil rights and the human rights of others.
And our thanks to Attorney General here in New York, Letitia James, for joining us for that conversation.